Welcome to Killer Women with your host, best-selling author Danielle Girard. And now, Danielle's next killer woman.
Hello, and welcome to Killer Women Podcast, a proud member of the Authors on the Air global network with more than 4 million listeners. I am your host, suspense author Danielle Girard, and my guest today is Emiko Jean. Emiko is the New York Times bestselling author of the YA novels Tokyo Ever After and its sequel, Tokyo Dreaming, the first of which was a Reese Witherspoon Hello Sunshine book club pick. Emiko's debut novel for adults, Mika In Real Life, was published in 2022 and was a Good Morning America book club pick. And The Return of Ellie Black, which is her debut adult thriller, is coming out now. And this, Emiko, this book blew my mind. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh my God, it's so fun. And we don't do spoilers on the show, so you're gonna have to read the book to have that mind-blowing moment. But I noticed that's what Jessica Knoll said too. I love that she's quoted on here as like, oh my God, it's a totally jaw-dropping twist. So tell our listeners a little bit about The Return of Ellie Black.
Sure. So The Return of Ellie Black subverts the classic missing girl narrative. The story begins with Chelsea Calhoun, who is a small-town Japanese-American police detective, and she receives a phone call that Ellie Black, a teen that went missing more than 2 years ago without leaving a trace, has mysteriously resurfaced in the woods of Washington State. And now Chelsea has this chance to solve a cold case that has never stopped haunting her. And even though, Ellie is seemingly no longer in harm's way, Chelsea's investigation is anything but open and shut. There are far more questions than answers. Who took Ellie Black and why won't Ellie talk about her experience? And as Chelsea digs deeper into Ellie's history and her recent behavior, which seems very suspicious, Chelsea runs headlong into demons from her own past, which is unresolved grief over her murdered sister and the subsequent fracturing of her family. The story is told primarily from Chelsea's point of view, along with flashes of perspectives from those close to Ellie. We hear her father and her mother, her sister, and we also get a firsthand account from Ellie herself of what happened to her. It's a book about trauma and survival and what it means to be a woman in a world filled with violent men.
So beautifully put. It is really, there's so many wonderful layers. And I wanted to start by talking about, so I quoted, and if you missed my Monday quote this week, it was from this book about, and I'll just give you a snippet because it's so powerful. I mean, there's a lot of, you guys know that when I love a book a lot, I note things, but here's a tip for all the girls out there. Never let an abductor take you to a second location. And it proceeds with the tips for parents, which include teach them to never pull over onto the side of the road when someone flashes their lights, or to walk into an alley next to a nightclub, or ride their bike down the street in broad daylight, or leave a motel room to find an unoccupied bathroom, which is how Ellie goes missing. But that part about the ride your bike down a street in broad daylight, right? Basically, what would we do with our children? We would lock them in a box. There'd be no. So this is it is such a poignant story because, of course, every young woman, Ellie makes a couple of bad decisions, right? Mm-hmm. But they're none of them egregiously bad decisions, right? She just is caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. So let's talk about violence against women.
Yeah. Yeah. And I challenge that notion about Ellie making bad decisions because I think, what she did is something that she should have been safe doing. Women should be safe going to use a restroom by themselves. They should be safe
for sure.
Hiking. And we have all of these rules that have been imposed upon women on how to stay safe. And so much is placed upon us. The onus is placed upon us, from birth and how to navigate this world that might hurt us. And, and one of the ways that it manifests is in this like victim blaming. And so I think, in the book, Ellie really circles around this notion that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. And there's kind of this childhood belief that, life is fair and you bring things upon yourself, but there is really no, I don't believe, karmic balance to the world. I think it's a way of people dealing with uncertainty, and it gives them a kind of security and a sense of invulnerability, which is a false sense.
I think you're totally right, and I want to amend that because I think this is so true of women everywhere. We are the ones. It's like what you wear can bring violence upon you, right? Versus putting the onus where it belongs, which is
Right.
on the people who commit the violence, not on the people who are the victims, because and that is so prevalent. I think it's almost worse now than it was a decade ago, with the yoga pants becoming a thing, and oh, she had it coming because she wore yoga pants, or and yeah, it's very, very fair.
Yeah, I think that, there's a line in the book where Chelsea says, maybe we should focus more on our sons than our daughters. And I've thought a lot about that in raising. I have boy-girl twins, and I thought a lot about the advice and how I raise my children and how it's different between girls and boys. And I've been very intentional about raising my son, to know what consent is. And if someone says no to you, you stop doing what you're doing, and you listen. And so I might have overcorrected because he's a little bit more timid now.
No. Oh, right. Well, that's actually better than the other end, right? I mean, he'll get his confidence. Right now, he's just practicing the listening part, which is
and I think that's so important, is that I've kind of tried to repattern my thinking and that psychology, and letting my daughter know, you can say no and you can be forceful. You can, if you say no, say it like you mean it, so I thought about that a lot in my own pattern, and it's how we raise boys and girls differently.
we do, we really do. And I think even, I mean, obviously, I think there's traditional ways of roles for men and women that that our ancestors taught us, and that's sort of really still deeply ingrained in our DNA, right? We're still fighting that, like I love the story. Would you, if you'll share it with or summarize it for the audience, about when you had your baby and what your mother said? I think that's just so typical. I
Yeah.
put you on the spot, but
Yeah, no, and it does harken back to the novels, how we treat mothers and fathers, men and women differently about the roles that they play in society. And after I was postpartum, after I had my babies, my husband made me a sandwich. He was doing most of the cooking, and my mom was very excited, and she was lauding him, how great it was that he had made me a sandwich. And I remember thinking to myself, well, he made a fucking sandwich. I don't know if I can.
no, you
but,
can absolutely. Right.
I was
right.
he didn't paint the Mona Lisa.
Right.
He put two
He also
pieces of
didn't
red
give
bread.
birth to twins, right? Let's put this in perspective here. He made this, and probably he made one for himself at the same time. So it's it's true. And that is actually, and one of the things I love about Chelsea, the detective, the Japanese American detective, is that her parents split. Obviously, when you lose a child, it's the chances of a marriage lasting obviously is statistically very low, and they split. And and her dad, her dad was a police officer, and so she's very close with him. And she, he, in the midst of this, she's also cleaning out his house, so there's all this emotion about the job he did. And he was really close. And I think we talked about this a little bit. It's the idea that how what we expect from our parents is different, right? So Ellie Black, her mother was, they had a much older child, Sam, right? Sam's like a decade older or even more.
Yeah, I believe so. She has a child she's pregnant when Ellie is taken, and then has given birth. There's a 2-year-old little girl when Ellie comes back. Yeah.
Right. So because the Blacks had this child really young, they had Sam really young, and they basically got pregnant, got married. And then they had Sam, and then they waited 10 years to kind of, how it is, the adult parenting, oh, we'll be so much smarter, when we're older with these kids, it turns out like every kid just levels you to like, you know, nothing about anything. And, you know, you think you're going to be smarter, but it has not happened. It did not happen to me. The second one was as much of a like, oh, fuck, as the first one. But, you know, and then, you know, Ellie feels like her parents are really strict and they won't get her a new phone. And it becomes this thing. And she really, you know, we put so much more of our anger and frustration on the mother figure, right? She ends up being the villain because she's there more, right? And that's the reality. I think you talked about this, and you know how we sort of your word was, you know, lionize our fathers and you know, and shred our mothers like, you know,
Yeah.
like catnip. It's
Yeah. We blame our mothers more, and we're it's a societal thing. I mean, it's built into us to blame the mom more than the father.
yeah. And
Mhm.
and it is ironic, right? Because in the end, like the father is just normally, and we're talking obviously in general stereotypes, but he's not available as much. So it's
Mhm.
his job is so much easier, right? He comes in, he sweeps in with a laugh and some jokes in the evenings and the weekends, and then he's off to work, and mom is there with the sort of like mess of every day.
Yeah, I mean, there's an expectation that men are emotionally unavailable, and then there's acceptance of that, and it's a false expect. I mean, it's not true. Men can be as emotionally available as women if we set up that expectation.
So that's what you're doing. Your son is a little timid because he's trying to like figure out all this beautiful emotional depth to himself.
Think so. I think he's building his emotional intelligence, and that's what I want him to be doing. I want him to be sensitive to others' needs. I want him to be listening, and I want him to, be adapting to that.
So besides like obviously the impact our parents have on building emotional intelligence in both men, boys and girls, what other factors do you feel like, you know, what else can we be doing? Like I feel like a boy who has a sister is better off than a boy who doesn't have a sister, but obviously we can't, you know, give every boy a sister.
Yeah. I think it's important to teach boys about consent, as I think we chatted about this before we started recording. And that if someone says no, you stop immediately. And in the book, there is a thread of, a discussion about toxic masculinity and kind of what happens to boys when we force them to turn off those emotional valves. In the book, we have, Ellie's dad, Jimmy, and he loves his wife and daughters, but he can't communicate it. There's a lot that's talked about his own past where he's asked to be the man of the family. And I think he had a stutter or a lisp when he was younger. And so he became very stoic and he stopped talking after that. And he couldn't talk to his own wife about his feelings.
Yeah.
And it's a big problem in their marriage, especially after Ellie, goes missing, is they can't connect emotionally then and grieve together. They diverge. And, his wife then subsequently feels very alone and isolated. And, Jimmy, for him, I think, his whole life he's felt alone and isolated. So that's kind of the norm for him. And he doesn't
Mhm.
understand how to breach that. With Ellie's boyfriend, when she disappeared, she had a boyfriend named Danny, and he has like this incredible pressure to be a hero, to like save her.
Right.
And he talks about that inability to save her and rescue her and how naked he feels. And I think,
Right.
that's something that we put on our boys too, is that pressure to be heroes and to fix things.
Yeah.
And so those are all the things that I kind of bring up in the book about toxic masculinity and ways to unravel it.
And I love like so what we I love because as you said, like Jimmy is a character who does not express himself, and yet he goes to the police department, like brings donuts and shows up to be like, is there any word about my daughter? Like so and then his wife doesn't even know that. Like she finds out about it later, which I think is so touching because we all like in grief, and we all have had forms of grief, you know, thankfully God, not like this, but we all, you know, it's how we sort of express that grief can be so private, but it does bond us when we are able to share those things. So I love that, you know, Jimmy becomes this really nuanced, deep character by these small actions, even without his ability to express, which I think you do beautifully, and you do it beautifully in your YA. I read Tokyo Ever After, whenever it was out as a Reese pick, and we talked about that a little bit too. And I'm going to get off topic for a second, and I want to talk about the fact that you've written so many just such different books. Obviously, the two Tokyo books were YA, and then you wrote a book that is adult drama, it sounds like, and now this incredible thriller. And how come you get to do that? How did you do that?
I know, we were discussing, I mean, there is you've had this too, this like pressure in publishing, right, to kind of pick a lane and stay in it. And to some degree that's true, because you want to build your brand and your audience, and in many ways I feel like that's kind of the smarter move to do that. But as you and I discussed, before we started recording, is that we both read so widely. Like I read young adult all the way to thrillers. I read romance. I read anything. I'm not much into sci-fi, but I do read pretty, widely. And, I was interested in writing all of it. And I've been fortunate enough to publish, young adult and adult fiction. And it's purely a reflection of what I enjoy and what I'm interested, both light and dark fare. It's,
yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead. I was going to say, I just go according to mood, and, it's, and it's nice to kind of have this, like, you write a really dark thriller and then you can go to like YA contemporary, and it's like a palate cleanser.
Oh, for sure. And I was telling you before we got on the air that I read so many thrillers. Obviously, it's what I write. It's it's for the podcast, and then of course I always want to read whatever new thriller is getting all the buzz. And so at spring break I make it my like mission. I take like 10 YA books, for 10 days, because those are so fun. You can literally like sit by the pool and read one in a few hours. And that was how I, read Tokyo Ever After, was that. And I love that fact, because you're right. And actually, I think it's funny building your brand, but why can't your brand be that she writes, you know what I mean? That she writes fabulously light, fun, coming of age books, and also really dark, nuanced, intense thrillers, because very rarely as a reader, I mean, the branding should be in the cover, and my copy of Tokyo Ever After is around here somewhere, but like this is clearly, if somebody picks this up and thinks they're getting a light, oh, it's upside down, hello, if they're getting a light YA, then they need to look a little more closely at the cover, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's telegraphed right through the covers, like you usually can tell. But yeah, I mean, I've always intended to write thrillers. My first young adult novel, which was published by Houghton Mifflin, was a thriller. And so I knew that I could always return to that genre. And if I mean, if someone is really familiar with my work, which I would never expect anyone to have this like level of detail, is aside from my first book, all of my books have a Japanese character or Japanese American character front and center. And so that's a core that carries through each one. That kind of exploration of what it means, or just being a yellow body in America.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because one of the things, we got into the subject of sort of violence against women, and yet Chelsea also suffers a secondary, it's an emotional violence against her because of the color of her skin, and the way that she's, did she come from I think there's one line where was you delivered in a bento box, or I mean, so talk to us about, and you're right, and that's a beautiful thing that you weave in, obviously from your own experience, and that we get from the character, and that we understand is another sort of layer at the core of Chelsea. So talk about that with us.
Sure. So Chelsea's background is that she was adopted into a white family, and she was left in a warming box at a fire station. So she has no history that came with her. She doesn't know who her biological parents were. And it's not something that she necessarily grapples with. It's not a book about adoption or her identity, but it is a lens through which she sees and perceives the world. And so she has been a victim of microaggressions in this very small mostly white town that she lives in. And I think that's made her become more insular, more like her father. She has kind of the same, she's inherited that kind of same stoicism from him when she's kind of unable to communicate and talk, and she's very withdrawn. And, you know, I think this makes her more empathetic toward the world and towards victims. And then layered on top of that is what happened to her sister, Lydia, who disappeared and was murdered when she was younger. And so that was really the most attractive piece in writing Chelsea. It wasn't necessarily her racial profile, but that she was a woman who believed other women, and she was their champion. And, you know, she, to a degree, understood what it meant to be impacted by male violence too. And so in a lot of ways, you know, Ellie and Chelsea's stories parallel each other, that they're both kind of navigating these landscapes of grief.
Yeah. Well, and I have to say, like, you know, also the thing about, you know, this, when you have a, you know, and I'm imagining obviously, but when you have this, you know, an origin story that is so unresolved, right? You don't know who your parents are. You don't know the circumstances under which they left you, whether it was because they couldn't take care of you or they didn't want to take, you know, you don't know any of those things. And it's sort of the missing girl inside, right? There's like a missing part of you. And that is such, and it's such a just delicately woven theme in the book about why you can imagine why Chelsea, not only because of Lydia, her sister, who, you know, who's killed, but also because of her own sort of always trying to find sort of that place in her that you don't have an answer for. We just don't realize the ways in which our ancestry, our parenthood just form us, right?
Yeah, there's a term for it called ambiguous loss. And it's what many parents undergo when they have a child that goes missing that is never found. And, you know, you're not allowed, there's never any closure. And so how do you live in kind of that limbo, you know, your entire life? And, you know, again, to some degree, Chelsea is living in that same thing with the disappearance of her sister, and then also with her adoption.
And we get that from the grandmother, is Gabrielle's grandmother, because there's another missing girl, and then, you know, and you know, and that grandmother has waited, you know, to, like you said, there is, that you hear this in the news and when you read true crime, is that people feel they just want the remains at some point. You know, they just want the remains so that they can put them to rest and know where their loved one is buried, right? Versus this, it is the worst nightmare, right? I mean, you can see that, like, you know that Chelsea went through it as a sibling, you know that the Blacks are going through it, that the idea that your child is missing. And I love that we start this book with her being found. How did you, you know, I mean, that is the opposite. That is never the way these books start. So tell us, like, you know, where did that come from? Like, was that your aha moment to sort of like, okay, now I got this, I know where I'm starting?
Yeah. So the inspiration behind Ellie Black is really drawn from stories about kidnapped victims who have returned. So I love true crime. I know that you do too. And I've especially been fascinated by stories like, you know, J.C. Duggars and Elizabeth Smart's and Amanda Berry's. I'm so interested in the endurance of the human spirit and answering that question of like, what happened to them, but more importantly, how did they survive, you know, something that might have otherwise destroyed them. And so that was the starting point of the novel. Was I had this image of a girl long missing, presumed dead, and running through the woods. And I wrote from there. So I wrote, as I mentioned, the novel is a multiple perspective novel, and there's a firsthand accounting from Ellie. And I wrote her journal entries first.
Okay,
And then,
I wondered about that.
yeah, and then I slotted in, because it's so hard to, it's such a delicate process to do like a past present multi.
Yeah.
It was really, that was probably one of the most challenging things in this book, was making sure all of these things, you know, all of these perspectives wove together, and, you know, each person's narrative like illuminated one, you know, the next part of the story. So that was the trickiest part, but I did write Ellie's, you know, account first, and then I worked into the present timeline.
And so powerful, because we get a chance to see, as you said, sort of the endurance of the human spirit, how she, you know, you know, how you end up, and the fear that comes back with her, right? The sort of the ways in which a captor changes, you know, teaches you. I mean, she wasn't allowed to use her own name, and all those things that are sort of all those forms of torture, really, right? Emotional as well as physical torture that you don't just emerge from. It's like, you know, it is, and one of the things I love, and we're not going to spoil the end of the book, but is just that sense that there's a lot, you know, that she is gonna make, like, you know, that she's going to make it through, but that it also takes you know, it takes this whole community of people. Everybody wants her to just tell them exactly what happened, to get the, you know, to get the story out, to go and, you know, especially Chelsea, right? She wants to find these people, but it's for Ellie, there's all these layers of, you know, of trauma, but also shame, right? Because somehow then you you know, you ingrain that, you know, shame into yourself from this horrible experience, which is another sort of really interesting and traumatic thing to overcome, right?
Yeah, she's navigating all of that. She's navigating the shame around what happened to her and, you know, the trauma. I've had my own like brushes with trauma, and it's always something that I'm interested in exploring in books.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it's there's so much research around how trauma chemically alters someone. Like it becomes, you carry the trauma in your body and you can pass it down to your children, which I thought was so fascinating when I read this book. It was called The Body Keeps the Score, but it's about
Yeah.
trauma and what you're
Yeah.
passing.
I know, I
And
get shivers. Yeah.
yeah. And how they, you know, you carry it with you through the rest of your life. But ultimately, you know, without any spoilers, the book is about how we can heal from that and move on. And I think there's a line in the book about Ellie learning to carry the grief in one hand and hope in the other. And I you know, that was kind of for her character arc. When I was writing her out, I knew that was a line that I wrote very, very early in the book. And I said, this is where I want her to be at the end of the story. And she's not necessarily all the way there, but you can see that there's promise of that.
And that's actually a lesson for all of us, right? It's like, because to every degree that we all have trauma, which, you know, I'm not going to compare the trauma to this kind of trauma, but we all have a trauma, right? And it's like, you know, it's like you don't get to sort of close the door on it, right? In fact, closing the door on trauma, we have learned, is really a bad idea, right? Because like a bunch of gas that just like, and then it's a little match, and then it's sort of it's explosive. So you really have to let the trauma out, and that inherited trauma that you talk about, like how it changes your you know, your chemical structure, and I mean, it's mind blowing, the research they're doing on it.
Yeah. I had one thing that had happened to me early on in my motherhood journey was my daughter had a very severe febrile seizure where she had to be intubated, and she was in a coma for a good 24 hours, and we weren't sure, you know, what was happening and if she was going to come back. And so that's the brush with trauma that I mentioned. And you know, there was a grief process that happened with me because there was some loss there, and you know, and even imagining that I might lose her forever was so
Right.
and I had to undergo my own therapy for that. And that is actually kind of the inspiration behind the psychologist that we have in the novel, because I had my own counselor in my own life that was so fundamental in making that change and helping me to heal from that and find joy again in my children, because I had this whole anxiety thing then when I was always
Right.
worried.
Of course. Yeah. As if you don't have enough anxiety just being a mom and top of it. Yeah. Right.
So, and so I, you know, as I was writing this book and these multiple perspectives, I was like, I want to make this psychologist really another hero in Ellie's life that helps her, you know, kind of, you know, again, navigate this landscape of grief.
Right. And she becomes a, you know, I mean, and then of course, Chelsea also, you know, I think, you know, she can't help Chelsea about Ellie, right? But she can sort of provide this background that I think gives Chelsea some footing in dealing with this case, and perhaps other, I mean, I don't want to discount Chelsea's fiance, Noah, who's also like, this is the thing about, it's Killer Women, so we talk about, the women, but like Noah was, what an incredible man, right? He sort of fell for her, thought she was super cute from the first time he saw her. He's a little younger, and he's trying to help her, put closure on her own past with the loss of her dad and his house, and yet she is like, she's done what, she's like her dad, right? She sort of holds that all in and away from him, and that's hard and frustrating for him, but he's a lovely supportive partner, which is, it's just lovely to read really realistic and fabulous men, in books.
Yeah, I really liked him as a character, and I wanted, their relationship does play a factor into the novel, and Chelsea's character arc and the discovery, all that kind of stuff. I don't want to go into spoilers, but I wanted him to be a good man. I wanted him to be supportive. He loves his wife. He wants her to have her career. He also wants her to be emotionally balanced, which I think is, in some ways, people can say that he maybe like drove her too hard on that, but I think he was just encouraging her own mental health in that regard.
Yeah, they're married. I forgot that. I don't know why I was thinking. I think it's because they're looking for a house. So I'm like, oh, they're just getting married, but
they're newly married.
They're
Yeah.
newly married. Yeah,
Kind
but
of
I
in the
think that's
honeymoon
right.
stage.
Yeah, I think that's right, though. I think he has to. Somebody like Chelsea, who's so sort of ingrained in her ways, also needs somebody who's going to really sort of push her. And of course, it doesn't go always well when you push somebody who's very stubborn like Chelsea. But I think that's an important and realistic. I mean, there's a point at which everybody would get frustrated with that. And I think that's why he's not a fake Prince Charming, right? He's a real man who adores his wife, who wants her to see that she has an unhealthy obsession. And I do think it's realistic, because you talk to people are married to police officers, or and it's their jobs are hard to put away at the end of the day, right? If there's a missing person out there, or somebody who's been killed in a grieving family, how do you walk away from that, right?
Yeah. I did a lot of research, and I talked to a lot of detectives and FBI agents and stuff like that. And mostly what I came away with that was across the board with all of them is that emotional and physical toll it takes on them and their families.
Yeah.
I talked to one detective who's a local detective, and they have a sex crimes unit, but they're only allowed to work in it for 4 months at a time, because it takes that much of a tax on their mental health. And so they cycle through it. So they're 4 months on, and then the rest of the year off, and then 4 months on. And yeah, I mean, they bring it home with them, and they don't come home sometimes too. And so there are these, partners that are left kind of waiting in the wings for, their person to show back up. I think Noah, is a nice counterbalance to Chelsea. And he's also, Chelsea's very much lost in like this dark, shadowy world.
Yeah.
And he kind of shows that there is another world that Chelsea could live in. So she's kind of, I'm going to follow up this book with a second book, and it does feature Chelsea again. And so she's, she's learning now to kind of straddle both of those worlds.
Yeah, I love a series, so I'm really excited to see Chelsea again. And I wanted Danny too. Danny, who was a teenager, right, when Ellie went missing, and who they had a fight, and so he didn't come to where she was right away. And of course, like, right, it's he's first of all, he's the first suspect, because he's the boyfriend, which is always the husband, the boyfriend. But he also, the way in which he supports Ellie through the book. I mean, I just think trauma can bring out the worst in people, right? Or it can bring out this sort of beauty. And I think that's one of the things, not that there's certainly bad guys in this book, there's no question. But the characters who show up for Ellie and show up for Chelsea, it's really powerful. It's a beautifully done book, Emiko. I loved this book. And I have to say, I love this cover. And when you read the book, you will understand that cover. I'm not going to tell you anything about it. So can you tell us a little bit? Are you writing the next book now?
Yeah. I was going to say about the cover too. I love covers that once you've read the book, you go back and you look at the cover, and there's little Easter eggs in there, and you're like, oh, I understand.
Yes.
Those are my favorite.
Because at first I was like, I don't get this, but I got it I got it. Yeah, like a third of the way or whatever. I was like, oh, I
Yeah.
get this. I know
Yeah.
exactly what that is. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's super fun.
Um,
It's a beautiful cover.
but yeah, the second book, is that what I lost the question?
Yeah.
Second book. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I just finished it and I'm revising it a little bit now, but it does follow Chelsea. And she has a new case. She's going to have a new partner, and she's going to continue on into this world of women that are the victims of violent men, and trying to help them. And I don't want to give away, if I tell you stuff about this new novel, I feel like I'll spoil the first
Yeah. You can no spoil it.
That's all I'll say.
That's fair. That's totally fair.
But we
So,
see, we see some of the characters from the first novel and the second novel too. So yeah.
I love that. I love that. And I think this is, there's the thing that you do beautifully in all your books is this sort of this rich, character development. This has a very intricate, twisty plot. So, which we're not going to talk about. Again, we're going to tell you all the things we're not going to talk about because you're going to want to read it. So we're not talking about that either. But also the way you do this you bring in these characters who just feel like people that, you could see in the world that are doing, that don't have easy circumstances and are doing the best they can and falling down and getting back up, which I think is part of the strength of the human spirit, right? We're all going to get knocked down. I mean, Ellie, these people in very intense ways, but how do we get back up?
Yeah, there was a quote, this isn't my line, but I remember thinking about this in terms of characterization in this novel overall. And it's give me tender hearts and calloused hands. And that's kind of how I felt about these characters, is they're raw people, they're flawed people, but they love very deeply. And it reminds me very much, it's very much I think the epitome of kind of that very small town feel.
Yeah. Oh, it absolutely has that. The good, the bad, the ugly, right? For sure. Well, that's okay. So it's interesting. You wrote the two Tokyo books back to back, right?
I think I wrote Tokyo Ever After, and then I wrote Mika in Real Life, and then I wrote Tokyo Dreaming. Yeah. So I did do a young adult, and then young adult, and then adult. Yeah. So I did.
And then adult. We're doing another adult.
Mm-hmm. Oh no, I've written since this book since this book, I'm struggling to find the word, was purchased. That doesn't sound right. Since this book,
yeah, no, right. Since you sold this one, yeah.
Sorry, I couldn't find the word. I'm a writer without words. Since it was sold, I did write another young adult book in the interim. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I love that. I love it. See, we're just and we're just gonna be able to, so we get the breath from you. You're creating your own, like we were talking about, like the palate cleanser, and you're just doing it for us. We read, if we read the Emiko Jean books in order, we'll get like a tense out of our brains, and then we'll get the this is so nice, and then back and forth, right? That's so fabulous. Well, it's inspiring. I love the idea that you're like, you know what? And why shouldn't we? I love the idea that you're like, I'm writing what I love to read, which is everything. And so why wouldn't I just get to write everything? And good for you. So are they different publishers?
Yeah. And so that's been a tricky thing, is I'm with Simon and Schuster for The Return of Ellie Black and my thrillers. I was with William Morrow for Mika in Real Life, and then I was with Flatiron for my young adult novels. So there's some juggling there, especially with publication dates and everything. But so far, everybody's has worked together really well.
Good. As they should. Keep them in line, because, we want it all. So, and they do too. But I think that's really inspiring. And I love that. And I do think if somebody, when you read The Return of Ellie Black, I think people should then go look at your YA, because I think it's it's another side of you. And, as long as you're not expecting blood and guts and murder, you'll be, you won't be disappointed. So that's fabulous. It was so fun, Emiko, to hear about your book. And I loved it. And I love the powerful way you talk about what women go through and the violence against us, and absolutely the ways in which we have to teach our boys to be, really better. They have to be better than they are, for sure, but they have to be almost better than women, because they they have a lot more control about helping the world be a kinder, gentler place, you know, with their friends, with the women they know, with their families, and with their own children. And so
Yeah.
it's really wonderful.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I feel this is my this is kind of the beginning of my interviews and publicity stuff for Ellie Black, and this was really wonderful and a great, rich discussion. And I'm always so floored and honored when people like the book. As you know, we write in isolation, and so you never really know how something's going to be received, and it's always so humbling, and just so honored when people read my work. So I appreciate it very deeply.
Well, it's your calloused hands and tender heart. It comes through, right? I think that's really powerful. Well, it was such a thrill to meet you. And I did love, in fact, when the book came across my, when I got the email about it, I was like, wait, I know that name, but not from thrillers. And so it was super fun. I love also that you're publishing, like sometimes they make you do a pseudonym for one thing or another. So I love that your name is on all these, because I do think, your books are amazing. So yeah, we all read. I think there's so few readers who don't enjoy different types of books. So I think readers of the other books, I think, will really love this book, and readers of this book will love the other. So it was so fun. Again, The Return of Ellie Black by Emiko Jean. Do not miss it. It's such a wonderful book. And Emiko, wish you the best of luck with all the events and all the craziness of publication.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Everyone, thanks for joining us on Killer Women with Emiko Jean. We will see you next time. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.